On this bonus episode of First Case, we're partnering with OR Manager to bring you an exciting educational session from the 2022 OR Manager Conference. If you enjoy this interview and you want to learn more, check out the next OR Manager Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, September 18th through 20th, 2023. You can view the full agenda at ormanagerconference.com, and you can register using a promo code PODCAST to receive a discount. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn.
Thank you, guys. I was trying to see if I get the microphone to work because I tend to not like to stand behind the podium, but I can't get it to work. So I will try not to wander from the microphone so you can hear what I'm trying to say. So here being at a manager conference, what am I doing here as an educator? Honestly, what I hope to impart on all of you is my job would be infinitely harder without the backing and support of management and leadership. So really, I want to kind of talk through some of the barriers that we have in providing good quality education to our staff, and we'll go through that through some of this. So our objectives today, I'm going to help kind of define the different types of hands-on activities in simulation, because when we think of simulation, we always think of that traditional put learners in a room, give them a scenario, have them act it out, talk for 40 minutes afterwards, and do it that way. But there's so many different creative ways that you can provide hands-on learning activities for your team. We're going to identify the barriers that managers face in incorporating hands-on education activities for their staff, and I'm sure you all will be able to identify with them. And then we're going to discuss strategies to address these barriers and understand the value that simulation has on team dynamics and how you guys can mitigate those barriers in providing it for your team. So I always like to start with some definitions because, we need to understand and have everybody on the same page as what we mean by simulation. So the Society for Simulation in Healthcare defines simulation as the imitation or representation of one act or system by another. Healthcare simulation can be said to have four main purposes: education, assessment, research, and health system integration and facilitating patient safety. So again, it's not just your learners going and doing an activity. There's so much more that is involved in simulation. I've got a slide here that kind of shows a depiction of what some types of simulation activities are. So you can have that high fidelity simulation like we talked about, the traditional, what we think of as simulation, but you can also do task training. I've got a picture over there of a laparoscopic task trainer that helps provide that muscle memory for staff that are learning to help with laparoscopic surgery. There's, practicing a skill, mixing dantrolene. Those are all things that isolated are still part of simulation. And then obviously, we can talk more about the full-blown, but for today, we really want to focus on some of those smaller activities that you can incorporate in your team. The advantages of simulation. I can't speak highly enough about the advantages. Often we are bombarded with all of these educational things that we have to do for staff. And when regulatory bodies come and look at us, they want us to prove that we've done it. And when there's so many different things that they're looking for, what's the easiest method of being able to provide that? A CBT. How many of you guys in here have your staff have to go through CBTs and it takes hours and you have a list of 15 different things that they have to do? You're able to provide that to the regulatory bodies that they did it, but you really aren't able to assess whether or not they retained it. Did they know it? And those only assess whether they have the knowledge. It doesn't assess teamwork. It doesn't assess communication, and those are all things that you can get from hands-on activities. It gives the learners freedom to make mistakes outside of patient care. What do I mean by that? They can actually go through that activity, and if there was something that they didn't quite understand or it didn't quite work as well as it should have, you can go through that so that when they encounter that situation in real life, they've actually gone through it. And it's not just remembering what they saw on a computer, it's actually remembering what they did, what didn't work, and they know that they need to do something different. And you can customize the learning experience. It's not one size fits all, and hopefully you guys will understand that you can break up some of these bigger objectives into smaller objectives. And then you can get that detailed feedback and evaluation. You can assess a lot of different things through hands-on activities. It also creates a culture of safety. In my institution, we have a big culture of safety. This type of activity allows them to, go through, they can identify potential safety threats and make improvements before they encounter that in real life. I can't speak highly enough about that. And then it gives psychological safety for the participants. They're not being judged if they don't necessarily perform a task the most efficient way. It gives them the opportunity to freedom to make those mistakes in a safe environment. I do have some practical examples to give you as we go through to kind of tell you how these types of activities have impacted my institution. Because when I started out as an educator 5 years ago, we didn't do a lot of simulation. Most of what we did were we did quizzes and, we read articles, we did, some of those type of activities. So we got the education, but we weren't actually conglomerating together to do those hands-on activities. So the first ever simulation that I ran was a high-fidelity simulation on malignant hyperthermia, which is a topic we're all familiar with. All of our staff need to have education on it, and often we're doing it annually. But my first task as educator was they wanted to do a simulation on malignant hyperthermia. So my brain, as a brand new, just graduated educator, was like, yeah, I can do this. We set it up as a high fidelity, meaning it was that traditional what people think of as simulation. So it was an hour long. I had, a 15-minute, scenario that they went through. We didn't have space to do it outside of the OR, so we had to block off an OR room, and we actually did it in the OR and an OB. And it was a big task. We did it, but there were some things that came out of it that weren't expected. And so these are the kind of things that I want you to be thinking about when you're providing education to your teams. In my department, we actually decided to go to a completely locked down unit for safety. That meant that all of the staff had to badge in order to be able to enter the department. Well, when we were in obstetrics doing this simulation, I have a smaller hospital, so we have one MH cart that lives in the OR. We weren't thinking that if we lock everything down, how is OB going to get up there? So as we're going through the practice of doing it, I follow this OBOR tech upstairs, and lo and behold, she goes to badge because she knew exactly where to get it. She went to badge to get in there to get the card from the cart to take it downstairs. She couldn't get in. I was like, well, that's strange. So I badged her in, and then we debriefed afterwards and found out that none of the OB staff had access to that card after hours, meaning they would have had to call the house supervisor. And at my hospital, after hours, it's just the call team. And if we don't have a case, we're not there to help. So this is just one example of some of the things that you can get out of it that you can't get by providing the education, having them take a quiz and go, okay, they know what malignant hypothermia is. So what makes hands-on education different from other modes? Because I'm not saying that every activity and every educational objective you have needs to be done hands-on. It's impractical. You would be just spending days and days and days, week after week, doing this with your staff. So you do have to pair that with other modalities, just as your CBTs, maybe, review a poster, talk about articles, doing an in-service. But I want to challenge you guys to look at the list of objectives you have for education for your staff and maybe pick 10% of those to do hands-on. Because what is gained? You're able to gain perspective from the learner's point of view. That is very important because different people see situations differently. They're not all the same. And that's one thing you can't assess by other modalities. Here you're able to gain, like asking the question, I noticed this went on, can you talk me through what was going on? What were you thinking as you were doing this? Not to correct them or say that they're wrong, because sometimes you'll be surprised at how from their perspective, you didn't think of it that way. And it changes how you provide your education to your staff. You can identify system and process issues that need to be fixed. The locking of the doors and our OB people not being able to get in there. We would have never known that, and what would have happened? the stars would have aligned. It would have been 3 a.m. They would have been doing a C-section. They would have needed it, and they would have not known until they went up there to get that. But we could be proactive and take care of those system process issues a little bit faster and make it to where they don't encounter that in the future. Honestly, I always say things that look good on paper, our processes, our policies that look great on paper, sometimes when we go to carry those out, there are things that just don't work. And so being able to practice those and identify where things aren't working so well and make those improvements is important. And then you discover different ways of doing things. I am amazed that a simple task like an objective in malignant hyperthermia, is get ice. Get ice. Do you know how many different ways staff members came up with getting ice? It floored me. We're sitting there in obstetrics and, it's, hey, I need you to get ice. And so they knew what they needed to do, but there was 5 different ways to do it. And they got creative. One nurse knew where those pads that they use that you break and they're cold. She grabbed 4 or 5 of those and came in, and I was like, I didn't think about that. And just the different things that go through the mind of the learner that are creative, because everybody sees things a little bit differently. And then also communication and teamwork. Again, you cannot assess that by having somebody sit behind a computer. You cannot assess that through an in-service, but you can assess that when you're doing hands-on activities. I went a little bit ahead of myself. There is more than one way to do something. And as we're going through the process, when we were in the OR, same task, go get ice. People knew where the ice machine was. I actually watched somebody take they're waiting for the ice to come out. Somebody took a garbage bag, put a rollerboard in it, stuck it up by the ice machine and pressed on it for the ice to go in. I'm like, I was like, talk me through, how did you figure that out? And they were like, well, I was trying to be efficient and, they had 2 people working together to do it. I'm like, that's ingenious. It's amazing how many different things you can get out of that. And if they were to just sit there and take a quiz and answer, yes, I know I need to get ice, we would have never discovered any of that. Also, how many different ways people were trying to call for help in a crisis. I was amazed at, somebody was like, I would just call the charge nurse. Somebody says, I would call the main line and have them page it overhead. And talking through those processes and trying to help people get on the same page as far as what should our process be. Because we didn't have a call this person part of our policy, but we were able to work with the team and find the best way to do it for our institution. So how is simulation used in the perioperative environment? It's used quite frequently in nursing schools for their education. It's used in other modalities. Healthcare simulation is a relatively new innovation, and sadly enough, it's not new. It's something that's been used in the military, it's been used in aviation, and it's something that we are just really scratching the surface of what we can do in potential in healthcare. We use it for hiring, new staff training. We can actually put them in a room, help them with, I do task training. It's a type of simulation, and they're able to prep. They're not prepping an actual patient. They're practicing the steps, and we're going through and we're providing feedback to them, and we're helping them learn valuable skills that they can take in so that they're able to be more confident when they get into the patient realm. Practicing low volume, high risk situations. I challenge you as you're looking at your list of objectives for education, when you have those low volume, high risk situations that you need to educate on, consider something hands-on. Because, number one, they're not going to encounter it very often. But I will tell you, from my experience and the experience of the people that I educate, they remember the hands-on stuff so much better than they do. Before, we were doing quizzes on MH, quizzes on fire safety, and often they get in autopilot. It's the same quiz, it's the same thing, they memorize the answers, but really do they retain it? But you put learners in a room, and you have them go through the motions of doing something and bring them in and have them talk through how things were going, they retain it a little bit better. Demonstration of specific skills. So, for example, we were having some variation in prep process for our extremities for total joints. And we were given the task of, can we standardize this? So regardless of the type of prep that you're using, and regardless of the surgeon, that we are using the same methodology. Not that the way they were doing it was wrong, but we were trying to mitigate. We had an increase in surgical site infections with total joints. So we went in and we essentially re-educated the staff with the demonstration. They were able to, we were having them return demonstrate, which is a form of hands-on activity. And as we're doing that, it's become standard practice for our staff. It was easier than having them watch a video or explaining something in an in-service. We actually had them apply the skill. Learning to use new equipment. How many of you guys do in-services on new equipment? And it's the vendor rep comes in, gives a little 15-minute blurb, says, I'll be there to support the case, and that's about it. Challenging you to, when you have a new equipment come in, maybe provide some of that, small group hands-on, okay, put this together. Giving them that muscle memory so that when they get in the situation, they're more confident with that new piece of equipment before they're having to use it. And then assessment of policy and procedure in practice. I can't speak highly enough about this because there's always something process improvement related that comes out of every single hands-on activity that we provide for my staff. And there are things that maybe you didn't even think were issues, but we're able to, again, make a plan to improve those processes and make them better. And I have that quote up there, what looks good on paper sometimes encounters unforeseen issues when put into practice. And it'll just amaze you how many times we've thought we've got these great policies and procedures, and maybe they need to be tested out. So what are our barriers? Because hands-on activities require time, resources, and space. And what do we not have a lot of, especially with the staffing challenges that we encounter? It's time. We don't have time. I will tell you that is a barrier myself as an educator encounters every single time. And I have a very supportive team that wants to promote hands-on activities, wants to promote simulation, but we struggle because we still have to provide, staffing for our surgical cases. We still have to, do other things apart from education. And again, trying to make room for that can be a challenge. Resources. Not everybody has resources. How many of you guys have a dedicated educator for your unit? Most of you. It's a luxury that some people don't have. I'll be honest. I am privileged to be an educator in my department and serve my department, but I've run into people that are like, well, I want to do that, but what do? I don't have an educator. Resources are at a premium. Do any of you guys have a simulation center in your hospital? Not everybody? I'm privileged that we have a sim center that we can use, but that's not the norm for everybody. So again, resources. Sometimes it means you're taking down an OR for the day. Well, what kind of impact does that have on your overall schedule? And then obviously space. You have to have space to be able to do these activities. And hopefully what I want to impart on you is these barriers, while they are big, I will be honest, they're not insurmountable. There are ways that you can get around some of these constraints and still be productive in your schedule. So how do we navigate those barriers? Because, again, those barriers, if we aren't able to navigate them, they're going to stop hands-on activities in their tracks every single time. First one I want to touch on is collaboration. As an educator, I can plan out the best hands-on activities and have it all laid out perfectly, but if I don't have that collaboration with my managers, with my director, and have their support, it doesn't happen. Communication. This is key here too, because you have to communicate with each other, such as we sometimes have an issue of, oh my gosh, we planned this activity 2 weeks ago and the schedule, it's bonkers. There's no way we're going to be able to give our staff the time to be able to go. Being able to communicate that and troubleshoot those things is very, very important. And then it's the commitment. Being committed to provide hands-on activities as a leader is so important, because I had mentioned at the very beginning, I can do great educational activities with hands-on learning, but I cannot do it if I don't have the support of my leader. Your support as a manager working with the director to provide these activities to your team is so very important. And again, there are going to be some times where you plan it out and it doesn't work out. So you have to defer that activity to a different day. The schedule, we don't even finalize our schedule until sometimes the day before. So it can look great, a week ahead, but then we get to the day and it doesn't work. So definitely that commitment to, okay, we can't do it today, but let's find another day. We're going to get this done. And you guys have such influence on the ability for your staff to be able to have these educational modalities. What I'm asking from managers is make it a priority. Because if you make it a priority, it becomes a priority. If I make it a priority, it's a priority for me, but if my director says it's a priority and we're going to get this done, let me tell you, it gets done every single time. You need to promote it. If you're not a believer in hands-on activities and you're promoting it, often it's real easy to allow those barriers to negate being able to carry those out. Participation. And this is something that I challenge my leaders. I'm like, as we're doing this, I need you to come down and participate in one of these sessions. I need you to see what's going on, because I give them an after action report. So they get the details of what happened for the activity and everything. But when they come down and they see it in action, it's enlightening for them, because they get to see the communication and the teamwork and all those things that they have direct effects on. They can see how that's actually working, or sometimes not working. And they're able to kind of work with that to promote growth for their team. And then partnership. Educators can't do this alone. I wish I could say I did. I wish I could say I'm Superwoman, but I can't. I am only as strong as the leadership that backs me up. So we talked about all the little negative things, how it's hard to do, how time can impact. But I do want to give you guys some strategies to help allow you to incorporate these hands-on activities in your practice. I always tell people, break things into smaller tasks. So if your educational objective is malignant hyperthermia, but you don't have time to run through a full scenario, can you give 10 minutes? Can you allow your learners 10 minutes of hands-on activity? Maybe we can't go through the full scenario. And this is where I've had to work together with my leadership team. What is the thing of malignant hyperthermia we want to focus on? Is there an aspect within there that we want our learners to be able to master? For example, mixing dantrolene. Honestly, that activity would take maybe 5-10 minutes. But it is a hands-on activity, and then, God forbid, you run into that scenario and it comes time to mix the dantrolene. You know what? Your staff are more confident. They've actually done it instead of, which honestly, I've been in my area for 10 years. We've not had it happen, but my staff know how to mix dantrolene because we were able to provide that small snippet. I mean, we give them the full education, and you can do that through a CBT and other things, but can you take a piece of it and give them a piece to do hands-on? You can utilize staff meeting time. Some people have dedicated staff meeting time, and if you do, I challenge you to maybe dedicate one of those staff meeting times to a guided sim where all the learners can go through the evacuation process if we ever had to evacuate the OR. Those kind of things. Some of you, and I guess I'll ask, do any of you guys have dedicated education time in your... I applaud you leaders for providing that, because that is a barrier that a lot of facilities face. I connect with educators, perioperative educators across the nation, and There are a lot of them that have that. There are a lot of them that don't. It is not the norm. So I applaud you for providing that, because that can be used for hands-on education too. So sometimes you already have the time allotted. It's just planning out the activity. And then if you're wanting to figure out, how else you can do it, look how other departments do it. Do you have other departments in your hospital that are providing hands-on activities? How are they managing it? How are they doing it? And then I want to challenge you to take a look at how much you're doing hands-on and increase it. Not necessarily increase it exponentially, but can you add 1 or 2 activities a year? Can you do 1 activity a quarter? Can you take some of those educational objectives and turn them into something that you can provide hands-on? For those of you who do not have a dedicated educator, or for those of you who do, just so you're aware, you do not have to reinvent the wheel for some of these scenarios. These scenarios, AORN has taken the time to build, and honestly, they've done a great job of, on their website, taking the educational content and putting it all in one place. And they have multiple scenarios. I think right now they're up to about 20. When I first started as an educator, they had 7. So they're doing a great job of providing, so you don't have to spend that extra time planning. So it's a time saver. You've already got the objectives and the scenario and everything. You just have to figure out how to execute it. And also there are other things within those toolkits that you can utilize to turn into hands-on activities. So definitely utilize those resources because they're available. They've already been developed by leading educational experts, and they are wonderful. I use them all the time. Some practical tips, and when you're looking at those challenges, I want to kind of impart on you, it's key to remain flexible. When I talk about flexibility, often my leader has told me, I want you to plan and schedule 3 simulations this year. I'm like, okay, I can do that. And he wanted the full blown, we'll take them out of the OR into the sim center, do it. But what we encounter, I told you guys before, time. Those things need to be planned well in advance and put on the calendar. So then we come close to the day and it's like, this isn't going to work. I've worked very hard with our sim center to be flexible. I can't get everybody there at 7:30, but can we bump that up to 9 because it looks like that's where we've got a hole in the schedule? Or it's a matter of we plan on doing an activity, but it's so easy to set up that I can, the day before, call the sim center and be like, hey, I'm going to bring learners. We're going to do Code Blue today. Some of those kind of things. So be flexible and be willing to bend a little bit and work with your educator to provide that experience. Be creative. I'm going to leave you guys with some creative solutions as well that will be helpful as you're thinking of the type of education you need to offer. And then look for balance, because again, I'm here to tell you, you cannot provide hands-on for everything. That's just impractical. And that's not, as all the value that I've told you that it is, I'm not here to try to take away some of those other ways to educate staff. But I really want to challenge you in how you're supplementing them. And then again, don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Often some of these basic things are already pre-built. We're talking about evacuation, Code Blue, rapid response, those kind of things. You can just take what already has been worked and customize it to your area. Some practical examples. I like to help you guys understand how it's benefited my institution. So our infection prevention nurse came to me and said, how do you guys, look at the turnover process as far as in-between case cleaning? Because my staff are responsible for in-between case cleaning. We don't do the terminal cleaning at the end of the day, but in between cases, it's our staff that are doing it. We don't have dedicated EVS. And she goes, well, the EVS people, they do quality audits periodically, and they have this system in place. What do you do for your staff? And I said, well, I go in and I do, I've given the education, and I do a visual audit at turnover. So I'm looking and then I'm giving them feedback on, you guys could have cleaned this surface better, you missed this high touch surface. But the challenge from my leadership was, how do we provide a simulation for this? Can we simulate it? And I said, well, I don't really know, but let me look into see what EVS is doing. Again, I said, look at what other people are doing, because sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I said, how are you doing your quality audits? And they informed me they use Glogerm. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a substance that you can put on surfaces. It dries, and if you shine a black light, you can see it. It lights up like a Christmas tree. It's wonderful. So as I'm talking to them, I'm like, well, I don't know how safe that would be to do that in a live patient environment, because honestly, I don't want to put our patients at risk. So we were trying to figure out, if I did the high touch surfaces ahead of time and then watched them during an actual turnover, what would that look like? And I'm like, I'm not comfortable with that. So then we kind of sat around the table and I said, what if we did a simulation? What if we actually went into an OR room that was completely stripped at the point where the case cart was being taken out and like the bed wasn't made, and they're at a point where they would be doing that high touch surface cleaning. And then somebody said, well, what if you went in there ahead of time where they didn't see you and you marked those surfaces and you brought your learners in and you made it a contest? You tell them, okay, here's the deal. I marked 10 high-touch surfaces. And as you can see, I've got a sheet up there. There's more. But what I did was I listed all the high-touch surfaces that we've been teaching them they need to be cleaning in between cases. I told them, I'm not going to tell you which ones, but I touched 10 surfaces. Or 12, or however many you want. I made it simple, so I said 10. I said, here's your cleaning cloths with your cleaning solution. You guys have as much time as you want, and I want you guys to, I'm not going to say anything, and when you are done, tell me you're done, and we're going to double check and see how well you got those 10 surfaces. So they're getting their cloths, and everybody's got their cloths. They're like, okay, they're getting this, like, did you get that? I don't think you got it good enough. Clean that. Oh, get that. Oh, I didn't get the lights. Like, the communication was awesome, and they were in it to win it, let me tell you. Took normally on average about 4 or 5 minutes. And then they would be like, I don't know. I go, well, you guys done? They're like, well, are we? I go, I don't know. You tell me. And when they got done, I was like, okay, so how well do you think you guys cleaned this? We think we did awesome. This was great. We did great. I said, awesome. So I started going through, and lo and behold, most of the surfaces, they got pretty good. I got to the hand sanitizer, and I had watched that nobody had even come close to touching the hand sanitizer to clean it. I shine the light, and they're like, oh. I go, how many times do we touch that hand sanitizer while we're doing patient care? And it was like a light bulb went off. And then we get to the phone, and I was like, oh, look, the phone looks nice and clean. I picked up the receiver, and what I did was I got it all over my hands. My fingerprints were all on the inside of that receiver. I said, how many times did you touch that to your face when you were answering the phone? And they got kind of quiet. And then as we talked, I said, so you guys did a really good job. There were just a couple surfaces. I mean, that's actually really, really good. But you guys had all the time in the world. And you also had 8 people in here. How often do you have 8 people cleaning the room? And they got really quiet. And then I followed up with, you guys were in it to win it. This was a contest. Are you in it to win it every single time? And somebody said, well, I think, but I don't know. And I said, well, this is the challenge. So the key takeaway for them was be in it to win it every turnover, because that's how you're going to make sure all your surfaces are clean. And honestly, that whole activity, including debriefing, took 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And I was able to now I have 45 staff. So this would be maybe a bigger challenge for those of you that have 50, 60 people coming in. But again, 10 to 15 minutes. Can you provide 10 to 15 minutes for your staff and do a unique experience for them? And let me tell you, I watched turnovers a week later. They were still in it to win it. It's amazing. Instead of just giving them the education and doing a visual audit, this actually brought it home to them where they could tangibly see what was going on. And it impacted how they did those room turnovers. Much more than me as an educator providing education, managers telling them what they need to do to be effective. And it increased the communication exponentially. Again, those are things you cannot assess just by providing them a PowerPoint, providing them a quiz, giving them the information. We did another one, and this is where I told you guys with your staff meetings, I hijacked a staff meeting. I didn't ask permission. I walked up to my boss. I said, I'm hijacking the January staff meeting, just so you know. And he's like, okay, what are we doing? I said, we're going to do an OR evacuation. He's like, I go, it's a guided sim. I don't need to break people into little groups. We're actually going to go through and talk through the process and see, what people are thinking in regards to if we ever had to evacuate. And honestly, I will tell you, it was mind-blowing. Just all the different modalities and different ways people viewed how we evacuate. And we were able to go through and talk through it as a group and come to consensus on this is how it should work. Some people were like, well, I'm going to get ready, the surgeon, we're going to get ready to, evacuate the room. I said, who has told you to evacuate? They're like, what do you mean? I go, well, should you just evacuate on your own when you hear there's a fire in another OR suite? Well, yeah. I go, honestly, you should be getting direction from whoever is the incident command, which would have been the charge nurse at the time. I said, because they're going to give clear direction on, how we should proceed. They know where the fire is. They know things that you don't know in the room. I said, so honestly, if you start moving and there's a total chaos, it's not organized. And so it caused them to think. And then we went through and we walked through where we would evacuate. I go, oh no, there's a fire here. They've said that we can't go out this way. Where's our secondary exit? They're like, well, what do you mean? They knew the primary exit. None of them were aware of the direction to go for the secondary exit. So again, those are things that provided some hands-on learning, and they were able to ask really good questions that we didn't have the answers to right then and there. Sometimes you go through education and they're going to ask a question and it causes you to need to do some investigative work. And that's okay. Those are things, being honest and being like, you know what, I don't have the direct answer to that question, but as part of the after action report, we're going to find out and we're going to communicate that back to you. I do want to let you guys know that as an educator, I appreciate the level of detail that our managers go into providing input for education. But it is so important to get on the same page with your educator. Because, there are things we go through every year and we plan. There are regulatory things, we have to do them. Those are just automatic, we don't get a choice. There are this would be nice to do. Things that, we haven't educated on quite frequently, but it's probably time to recycle it. And then there are the learner needs. The last challenge I want to present to you as managers is if you're not already doing it, work with your educator to do a needs assessment. Because what you will find is what you think your learners need may not always line up with what they think they need. Maybe I always put on there, what piece of equipment are you struggling with that you would like education on? What procedure are you having difficulty with that you would like more education on? And that provides that information that you can go through and say, okay, what do we want to do hands-on here? Okay, they're struggling with this piece of equipment. Let's do that hands-on. That would be good. We're struggling with, surgical site infections. Let's do this. Being able to look at those kind of things and determine activities that would be appropriate for these hands-on learning experiences is going to be very valuable, and it will pay out in dividends for you as a leader. Because your team will be more focused, your team will be ready for some of those instances that hopefully you're not experiencing fire every day. Hopefully you're not experiencing MH every day, but you can be more confident that your team is prepared and ready to go. I have provided some key references as well that you guys can go to or your educator can go to that will be incredibly helpful, and the slides are already uploaded to the app. I would like for you guys to, go ahead and look into some of these resources because they're very valuable. AORN has, like I said, wonderful education. Healthcare simulation standards of best practice. If you're not familiar with them or your educator isn't familiar with them, make them familiar with them. Because they're able to look through that and be able to understand what their role in providing hands-on simulation is. And honestly, I do want to tell you that it's not always the activity itself. I want to challenge you that yes, you can assess whether your staff mix dantrolene, but it's some of those other things, the cognitive things, the going from the learner's perspective that can provide you such valuable information as a leader, and it can help you in building your team and making your team stronger. And that is the end of what I have. I am available and open for any questions that you guys might have.
Hey, Crystal, great job. I have a question about your after-action report. So can you walk us through what that looks like, please?
Oh, sure. So what I do is, as we're going through the activity, I'm taking notes. And so if there was something within that hands-on activity that they struggled with, if there was a quality concern, a safety concern, for example, with malignant hyperthermia, we noted that the OB staff couldn't get in. That was part of our, now granted, that was something we didn't wait until afterwards to fix. That was fixed the very next day. But those are things that we include, like what were some of the things the learners were talking about? What were their difficulties? Was there something that they brought up? And then we also end every debriefing with a key takeaway. So everybody goes around and says, one key takeaway that they're going to take from that experience and be able to utilize it in their everyday practice. Honestly, it really is kind of a high-level detail that the manager can look at and go, we've got a problem here with some quality issues. We've got a process that isn't working, and it allows that manager to help create actionable items to be able to address those. So it's really important not just to provide the activity, but to note, document, and be able to provide that feedback to the leadership.
We're challenged with sharing that education on the evening, overnight, and weekend shifts. Thoughts and suggestions for that?
That's something that I hear quite a bit. Honestly, this is where, do you have a dedicated educator? Okay, so this is where planning out those activities, maybe you're not going to do as many hands-on activities because it's important to try to provide it within the time frame that your learners are going to be there. But I have had it where we have had it like during the day where it's planned out ahead of time and people sign up and it's expected that they go to. But I would say, trying to, do some during the day, schedule some, during the evening, and then some during your overnight, which would mean that your educator would have to be there during those times. But honestly, there's no one right way to do it. It just depends on the direction that you would like to give as a leader. Are you okay with staff coming in their off time doing it? Or do you want to try to do it within their allotted schedule time? So, and that's something you can discuss with your educator and find out, what's going to work best for your team. We typically try to do ours during the day, and I'll stay even later into the evening and provide a couple sessions in the evening to cover that. But again, it's all up to how you want to allocate that resource. Great question.
Thank you. Crystal, great presentation. Thank you. How do you encourage the staff members that've been in a place for 20, 25 years and they know it all? How do you get their buy-in to sign up for education, to actually pay attention what's going on in the education? Thank you.
That's a great question. I have a mixture of a lot of newer staff, but I do have some what I would call seasoned tenured staff that have been there for 20, 30 years. And it was a struggle at first. Now, your new nurses coming in, simulation and hands-on activities are nothing new to them. It is ingrained in their programs. They are doing it. But when you get to those people that have been there, even 15, 20 years, that was not part of their program. They didn't do those activities. So it was a struggle at first, and they were very resistant. They're like, this is dumb. I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, and you get that. I already know how to do this. But get them to that first hands-on activity. Because what is amazing is they learn something new too. And for example, with that very first simulation I did with malignant hyperthermia, they struggled. Like, I'm like, they're like, well, I mean, I know the actual mixing of dantrolene, they struggled. They were struggling, and then talking to them, I'm like, you know what? How did that communication work go? You know it, but how did you work with your team? All of a sudden it was like, you know what, you knew it, but you weren't communicating well. So those that, were needing some direction, you weren't giving it. So honestly, getting them to that first one and then being consistent with providing hands-on activities. As a manager, again, making it the expectation that all of your staff are participating. Do not make it optional. Because if you make it optional, there are going to be some people that don't think it's worth their time, that they already know. But if you make it the standard that these are the activities that we are doing for the year and everybody's doing them, regardless of how much you know or don't know, it does make a difference. Because, I've done both where we've like, oh, it'll be optional. Nobody attends. If your in-services are optional, nobody attends. But if the manager says they have to attend, me as an educator, I don't have that kind of authority, but my manager does, my director does, and having them back me up and say, we've planned this activity, this is important, she did this as a direction from me, you need to do it. And after time, like we've been doing this for 5 years, now that we do a simulation or a hands-on activity, I don't get that as much anymore. They're actually immersing themselves in with everybody else, and they're working on their teamwork and communication, which maybe they know it all, but are they the best at teamwork and communication? And it has improved the strength of our teams. Definitely. Great question.
So I'm an educator, so I really do appreciate everything we heard today.
I just want to say, happy Educator of the Year for NLN. They announced this year in 2022, NLN has made 2022 the Year of the Nurse Educator.
Oh, nice.
So
I need to. Do you have any other great stories of simulations you've done that have been successful? Just pick your brain.
I have walls of stories because one of the best ones, we were in our education planning meeting a couple years ago, and we were having an issue with incidental needle sticks. And our simulation person who we debrief with her, and we bring her some of the things that we want to put on, for education. And she looks at them with us and she goes, okay, how many simulations do you want to do or hands-on activities, and what topics are the top ones? Because she helps us to narrow down, and that way we're not trying to, solve world hunger. And we came to, that was a very important safety topic because we were experiencing an uptick in accidental needle stick injuries. And my boss in that meeting said, well, why don't we do a simulation with that? I'm like, well, we can't simulate that. You're wrong every time. Don't ever say you can't simulate that. You can simulate just about anything. And so she, Angelia just asked, well, what does that look like? When it happens, talk me through it, because she's not a nurse. She's not clinical. And I said, well, they're in there and they'll be, working with a sharp, and often there's distractions and there's other things going on and the person accidentally gets stuck. And she goes, well, we could create a scenario where you bring your learners in, we have the fake mannequin and, all the setup to make it look like the OR. And what if we have an actor be the surgeon who's being careless and as they're going through accidentally sticks somebody, which we didn't really stick anybody. We used a fake needle, but, and I was like, well, I guess we could do that. And it was amazing. That simulation blew my mind because it didn't take very long. We brought him in there and it was about 5 minutes before we get to the place where the actor accidentally stuck somebody or stuck themselves or whatever. And we were able to talk about deeper issues. We were able to not just talk about what was going on, but distractions. How are they handing off sharps to the surgeon? How is the surgeon handling the Mayo stand? How do you police your sharps? And then, some people were like, well, I noticed that they were being erratic and they weren't really paying attention, but I said, so would there be any place where you would speak up and tell a surgeon, hey, you know what, we need to pay attention, or don't grab something off the Mayo stand, let somebody hand it to you. And we got into such deep discussion about the root of the problem. And we were able to work together and communicate. Now, then talking about, do they know what's best practice? And, best practice is to have a neutral zone where nobody is touching the sharps. Were my staff doing that? No, they weren't doing it in practice. And so talking through best ways to prevent it from happening and understanding why in situations, and they were able to talk about situations where maybe they had been stuck by a needle in the past. It was one of those things that it just expanded my mind on what could be done through hands-on activities. It was great. I was actually playing the surgeon for one of them, and one of my seasoned 30 years nurse was in there being the second scrub, and I'm like talking, and as I'm like being erratic, she's like, she knew it was coming, and I turn around and I finally just, to end the scenario, I accidentally stuck myself. And I asked her, I said, so you were waiting for it to come, right? And she goes, well, I knew that was why we were here. We were here for needle stick injury. That was what it was. So I knew that somebody was going to get stuck. But in my OR, it is never going to be me. And so I go, okay, well, what did you notice, or what could you have done to prevent me from getting stuck? You were protecting yourself, which was great. And she goes, well, doctors sometimes, they're just not paying attention. I go, could you have told me to pay attention? Could you have called out that erratic behavior? And it just really, it improved the safety of my team. And not that we are at zero with accidental needle stick injuries, but we have decreased them. We have improved, and it's all about that learning experience, because I could give them, okay, you guys, we have too many needle stick injuries, so we're going to go through some education here, and this is how you prevent it, and all that stuff, and check the box and say, we did it. And sometimes that's the mind frame that we're in. Okay, we've got a problem, we're going to provide some education somehow, and we've educated them, we checked the box. But look at how much more we got out of it by providing that hands-on. And that whole activity was supposed to take 30 minutes. Unfortunately, I will say, with all the great debriefing we had, it was usually about 40, 45. And when I gave the after-action report to my managers and leaders, they were astounded. They were like, what can we do to take all of this information and promote safety and teamwork for our team? And it has really helped the managers, honestly, in providing them that feedback. We've done fire in the OR. We've done, obviously, I've talked to you about malignant hyperthermia. We've done Code Blue, which actually was very valuable. If any of my staff members were here, they would say, please don't plan a simulation activity on something, because every time you do it, we encounter it. I will not lie, it happens. We actually had, we did Code Blue, and I was in a room a week later circulating a case, and I hear overhead, Code Blue, OR, room 5. I was like, no. And it actually happened. Some Lombardi cocktail got injected in the systemic system, and the patient completely coded. And we had talked about in our debrief, how do we call for help? Do we page it overhead? That was the big controversy. Do we page it overhead? Do we call in-house? You've got anesthesia there, you have a physician, And we talked about the consequences of going one direction versus another, but we found if we call the code team and we get them in there, that house supervisor is expert in documenting Code Blues. So they're doing our documentation. We have respiratory on standby. We have a chaplain for the family. If we're doing it all internal, not getting that external help, we're not contacting the experts. And it's very controversial. Do we call it overhead? Do we not? The fact that the staff, after that experience, called it overhead, and we were able to go through, okay, how did that work? We have it standard where my boss has said, if we're getting the crash cart, we're calling it overhead. That's not going to be true for every facility. I'm not promoting that. That may not be best practice for what you do in your setting. But again, it speaks testimonial to going through the simulation, provided some standardization, and got everybody on the same page. There's multiple things you can do. I've done lots of smaller activities that have really helped the staff drive the point home of what we need to give them learning-wise. It's a great question. All right, well, I want to thank all of you for attending today. It's been an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you all. I empower you to go provide hands-on learning activities for your teams. And honestly, it pays out in dividends for you as a leader because you get such rich information that allows you to make those changes where I can't make them as an educator, but you guys can.